Check it out.
Welcome to Top of the Class. Hear from education experts and get insights from high achievers to learn how you can do the same.
Get into those top schools.
Ready?
Proudly presented by Crimson Education, the world's leader in university admission support.
Hi, Allan. Welcome to the Top of the Class podcast. It's fantastic to have you on the show. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Basically, I live in Singapore. I've been living here for the past 2 decades now. Wow, it's been already 2 decades. But before that, I was born and raised in the United States. I was born in Santa Monica, California, and then grew up in this small suburban town in Los Angeles called San Marino. So that's where I think attended my primary school, elementary school and high school. And then I went through the very, very challenging process of applying to college, and then was decided to go to UC Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley in 1990. And graduated from UC Berkeley with a degree in integrated biology in 1994. And after that, worked for several years for a biotechnology company. During that time, I kind of realized that maybe I had more of an interest, not in the laboratory and maybe more in entertainment. And so I kind of pretty much pivoted my way or segued my way into the entertainment industry, started taking acting classes, modeling and stuff. And then did that in San Fran at first. And then I went to LA. And then from there, I went to Taiwan, became a VJ for MTV, which was very, very big at that time. And then from there, went to Hong Kong, started the biggest movie company there, but realized I didn't like Hong Kong as much as I thought I would. And then I ultimately ended up in Singapore, where I pretty much, based myself here, started acting and hosting in English and in Mandarin. Met my wife at the time and then had 2 children. And also along the way, was selected to be the host of this show called The Amazing Race Asia. And since then, I've also done 2 other versions of The Amazing Race called Amazing Race China Rush, which is based out of Shanghai, China, and also an Amazing Race China Celebrity Edition called Jisoo Qianjing. But during that entire time, I've also hosted a lot of events, endorsed a lot of products, done a lot of TV commercials, acted in a lot of TV dramas, Chinese and English, done film. So basically just, even though I have a college degree, I must confess I haven't really utilized it to its fullest potential once I decided to kind of embark on a career in entertainment and media. But still, even to this day, I'm forever grateful that I had the opportunity to apply to university, and also I think have those skills, in and outside the classroom back at UC Berkeley, that have enabled me, I think, to have that edge and have that advantage, I think, in anything I do, though, too. So, yeah, that's pretty much my life in a nutshell right there, though, too. So here I am now in Singapore still. My daughter now is 16, will be 17 this year, and she has just embarked on her own journey with Crimson also to start applying to universities to herself. So, yeah. So it's an exciting time, stressful time for her, but for me, it's a exciting time to see how everything goes working with Crimson, but even more importantly, just to see how different things are now than when I applied over 30 years ago. Wow, it's crazy. Yeah.
What are some of the things that you're seeing already in the differences between when you applied versus when your daughter's about to go through the application process? I'm going to guess, Cal Berkeley has always been a great university, but even now, the competitiveness of the college application processes have kind of skyrocketed even more just in the latest admissions round. It's just, skyrocketed mainly because the US colleges weren't requiring the SAT. So thousands of more students were submitting their applications. It must be a pretty big difference to when you first applied in the 90s.
It was definitely. I think right now, like you said, it's just a lot more competitive now. I think back then, as an American applying to U.S. universities, it was primarily from my vantage point, mainly if we were Americans, we would just apply to schools in the U.S. But I think, everyone, knows that the U.S., personally, I still believe the United States has the top, universities in the world. A lot of the very, very best are right there. Of course, there's some in Australia and the UK, but when you think about the very top universities, you think of a lot come from the Ivy Leagues or, from different locations in the US. So now in this day and age, I think it's become so competitive. It's like another whole, it's not just about getting, it's all about trying to get into these universities, not just trying to get out of them, I think, though, too. So that in itself has made it really, really challenging, I think, for the students and made it very, very stressful. So I think it's important for these kids to understand that it's not just about the grades, but it's also about, curating and I think and developing the right profile and the right resume, the right background in order to I think really attract like the top universities too. But I think for me at that time, it was more okay. We knew what the top schools were. We would apply to them from the U.S. into the U.S. But now I think because I think with the advent of technology and the internet, it's become more of a global thing where people from Africa, from Europe, from Australia, from Asia can all apply to schools all around the world. That's why, like you said, we've seen a stark increase in the number of applications when it comes to students that want to apply to university too. On top of it, like you said, with the global pandemic also, I think SATs weren't required. So even people now that maybe thought, maybe I don't want to apply to one of these top tier schools, my dream school, but I'll do it now just because they don't need my SAT score. So it was even less of a criteria. So you have even more applicants applying to schools around the world, like a dramatic 20, 25, 30% increase. So as an admissions officer, you have even more, I think, students applying to your school, and it makes it even more competitive. And also now, I think with internet, it's just a lot easier too, right? Everything's all digital. Back then, everything was handwritten. We had to, snail mail everything in. We did everything the old school way. Everything took a lot longer. Now it's like UC schools, I think the Ivy League schools have one day where they just send it all out. You're all notified on the same day whether you got into the school. It's not like it's rolling admission anymore too. They can just let you find out on that same day whether you got into that school. So it's completely changed. The entire landscape has changed, I think, for students these days. And it is very stressful, I think, for a lot of these kids and the parents of these children. But even more importantly, there's I wouldn't say a lot of minefields, but a lot of information that we as parents and also children can, I think, try and have access to, I think, with experts in the field to help them along the way in terms of trying to figure out which is the right school for them and why would it be the right school? Do they have the major they're looking for? But on top of it, even more importantly, before they even decide on that school, how good or how appropriate or how aligned are they in terms of their grades, their background, their interests, their, I think, resume into getting that school, I think, though, too. So it's a huge challenge. I think back then was already challenging. I think now, just because it's not just like an American, I think, playing field. Now it's a global playing field too. So you're competing with students from all around the world. On top of it, there are a lot of these different, there's the business, like with Crimson Education too, the business of getting your children into school also. That's because people realize how valuable, how important it is to get into a university too, especially a top, name brand, prestigious university. The competition there is cutthroat, right? It's like, you could score a perfect score on the SAT, and that would obviously let you be seen, but then is it enough, when there's a lot of other kids that are also, scoring 1515s or 1600s on their SATs, is that still going to be enough? If there's a lot of kids that are scoring there too. So there's a lot of different factors now in play that we probably didn't really think about back then, but now I would say it's now broken down more into a science too of not just, I think graduating, but of just trying to get into the right university. So it's completely changed. And I'm just glad, honestly, that I'm not applying to university now because it's pretty stressful. Now it's actually, for me as a parent, it's I wouldn't say it's stressful, it's exciting, but I can take solace and I'm happy to know I'm not the one that has to actually apply myself now too.
Yeah, I think that's probably a shared sentiment from a lot of parents. They're like, oh, geez, I'm glad I'm not going through this process now, because it really has ratcheted up a lot in terms of the pressure and that, there's just not as much margin for error, I think, because there are so many more applicants and just so many more kids doing like that extra check that can pick up that spelling error that might be the difference. And it's so unfair in some respects, but that's just the nature of the beast, unfortunately. But in terms of your approach to the application from a parent's perspective, are you trying to be more hands-on, more hands-off? Like, what do you try and see as your role, and how do you understand your role with your daughter? Are you like discussing with her, being like, hey, what do you want me to do for you in this kind of situation? I know it's high stress and high pressure. I'm sure there's parents out there who are like nagging or trying to be ever present, or there's a whole range of different strategies parents might have to kind of help their teenager through this time. What have you tried and what have you seen work for you?
I think for me, honestly, a lot of it really depends on the child and their personality and how they want to approach it. I mean, personally, if I had a choice, I would be that tiger daddy, the one that's hovering, like a helicopter daddy, just hovering the entire time and trying to be a part of the process the entire way. But I've realized, like with my daughter, she's very independent, very proactive, and very organized. So, like I would like to be in on all the calls, with the Crimson team and also with her, college counselor at school. But she would just like to be a lot more autonomous and a lot more, I think, independent in her approach. So I'll respect that. And I see her results and she's doing well. So if you prefer to be like that, then that's fine. But I think personally, I would much rather be a lot more, I think, hands-on and get right there in the mix of it all. But I also know my daughter is someone that prefers to just do it by herself. So I will respect her decision and let her go about it herself too, with Crimson and also through the entire process. Because I've even told her, like, I want you to just write down a list of the universities that you really want to apply to. Let's figure out how we want to, I think, map out your course for the next 2 years, as you apply to school. But I think, for her, she already has a good idea of what she wants to do and, in terms of planning out where she wants to go to school. And I think from there, creating her own narrative and how is she going to stand out for herself. But that's just her personality. I think for a lot of other children, someone who might not be as proactive, someone who's maybe not as organized, then you have to be a little bit more naggy and have to, pester them a little bit more. But a lot of it just depends. First of all, I think it's important to just kind of identify the child and their personality, how motivated they are, how organized they are. And then from there, I think it's easier for the parents to deduce what type of approach they need to take. If they're a parent that, is pretty much, I wouldn't say apathetic, but doesn't really care about how well the child does, and of course they'll take a very hands-off approach. But some parents, maybe some Asian parents in general, are very, 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 I think, concerned and very, very passionate, overly exuberant about their kids getting into a specific school. So they're going to be a lot more, I think, enthusiastic, but that can also backfire if they don't realize that their kid can do it all by themselves very, very well too. So there is, I wouldn't say, a fine line, but I think the most important thing is just to listen and acknowledge and understand their own children and the type of personality they have, their attitude, their own, I think, motivation, and how they're going about accomplishing their own goals. And if they seem like they're doing pretty well, then just kind of let them do it. Unless, I think they are asking for more help, more support from Crimson or from the parents, then that's great. But if they can go about doing themselves, then I'm all for it though too, because they're on the cusp of being a legal adult right there too. So this would be their first opportunity, if they so choose to just try and give it a whirl themselves and see how things go through the whole college application process. But I mean, for me personally, I would love to be a lot more, I think, in the loop and, on the calls. But I've realized with my daughter, she prefers to just kind of go about herself. So I'm like, okay, if you want to go that way, then that's fine. But if you don't get into your dream school, then I'm gonna give you a fat "I told you so" too. No, I won't say that,
I was gonna say that's pretty harsh, but there is a certain challenge, I think, from your side, where it's like, okay, my role is as dad, and I need to try and kind of stay in that role for my daughter and not move into the college admissions expert space. Say Crimson's in that space, leave that space to them. I'm going to stay dad and do all the things I can do from this role and from that emotional support role. And then, they've got a lot of advice already going through their head from their school and college counselor or their, Crimson advisor at this stage. So it's probably that moment where you can be like, hey, I'm here to talk things that aren't college related, kind of take a bit of the pressure away sometimes. So it can really, it's such a tricky thing. And I think that communication between parent and student or parent and child, I should say, is super important. And I've always heard from, when we're talking success stories of students getting in, a large part of it is like, my parents knew what role I wanted them to play. And that's really critical. And sometimes your child will say it out loud and be like, hey, this is the role I want you to play. And sometimes it's just kind of understanding each other and knowing what that child needs at this particular time. I will challenge you though to see if you can continue to kind of back off as the application dates approach. I'm sure that's going to be pretty tricky.
Yes, it will be. I think right now we're still kind of early in the game. She's not. Yeah. I think she's still getting ready to take the SATs and ACTs, and next year, like you said too, when it's time to actually really, really hunker down and start applying, deciding which schools to go to, then that will be more interesting. Also, I think I'm asking which schools do you think you want to go to? Would you want to apply to? Because right now it's still quite early in the game and looking at what she wants to do. But like you said, that will become a bigger challenge for me too. So we'll see. I'm looking forward to it. And hopefully I can maintain a hands-off approach if she prefers that, instead of like just trying to get my face all in there too the whole time. So
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
see.
yeah, exactly. That's the real challenge. Now, one of the things that I think is always fascinating is the analogies that people might have for the college admissions process. I was chatting to one of our admissions experts just recently, Steve, who runs our TikTok channel, who's a former U Chicago admission officer, and he compared
Mhm.
it to a board game that someone's mum had lost the instruction manual to. And no one really
Mm.
knows how to play the game of admissions or applications, and everyone's kind of just guessing. And his role in that instance is to try and help people understand the game and try and be the instruction manual in the absence of the actual instruction manual. But one of
Mhm.
the games that you are very familiar with is The Amazing Race. Now, I'm a
Yes.
fan of the show. I wanted to apply it when here in Australia, and had a
Mhm.
maiden mind, and we were all pumped to go. But when I see the show, I tend to see that there's a lot of do's and don'ts in terms of mentorships, partnerships, communication, teamwork, all these bits and pieces that are so relevant to other areas of life. And I think that's what's made the show a success in many ways. But are there any things that you learned from being the host of The Amazing Race and the other shows that you were a part of as well, that you can kind of identify and say, yes, these are the kind of pairs or these are the kind of groupings that really are successful for a number of reasons. And a lot of the things that they do can also be applied to other areas of life, like college admissions.
I think that's a very good analogy I think we can have there too. I think the reason I love the show so much is because it's really, really, I wouldn't say it's really, really merit based, but it's also based on relationships, right? Obviously in The Amazing Race, it's based on teams of two people.
Yeah.
And those teams of two can be, I think, from a different perspective, we could say it's maybe the student and the parent. I think maybe it's a father and a son, or a mother and a daughter. And it's about their relationship. I think the key to doing well, let's say in a show like that, or when it comes to applying to university, or trying to accomplish one of these tasks, or finding these clues and being able to complete it as quickly as they can, is communication. I think being able to communicate, I think conveying their feelings, how they're feeling at that time, when they're under all that duress, under all that stress, when there's other teams that are catching up to them or they're falling behind. It's two main components. One is communicating between, let's say, the two teammates, or between, I think, the child and the parent. Another is also, not getting over stressed out though too. The reason the show does so well is not because we go to all these beautiful locations, or, I think the reason it does so well is because we love to see the human element of it though too. How people, I think, interact with each other, how the relationship changes, under stress, how they're doing. I think, how people start arguing, if they're, I think a little bit overwhelmed, or how they've been able to stay cool the entire time too. So I think for me as a host, it's really fascinating to see human nature, like right there under the microscope, as we're traveling to all these different exotic locations around the world. We have a variety, a wide, huge, I've I think hosted 12 or 13 different seasons of The Amazing Race with 3 different versions or franchises. So I've dealt with, people from all around Asia, from all around the world, from China, from number 2. So it's interesting to see, it doesn't really matter where we all come from. In the end, if we pretty much distill it and break it down to its basic elemental form, in the end, it's all about relationships, and about when we are faced with a task or a challenge, how are we going to go about completing it with my so-called, teammate here though too, and what's the most effective way to get it do? How do we communicate? Who's going to be responsible for what? And how can we get this done as soon and as quickly as possible? So I think for me, what I've always enjoyed about the show, of course, the traveling is amazing, and I love being able to travel around the world, but I think it's also really great just to see, people that maybe people I think didn't consider more of an underdog. Maybe they didn't think they'd be a strong team, but because they have really, really good chemistry, they're really cool under pressure, they're very resourceful, then they end up doing very, very well. So we all love to see surprises. When it comes, if I want to, I think relate that, let's say to college and stuff though too, definitely there's a lot going on there too, because like you said, with Steve, I think, from University of Chicago, the race in itself is also pretty much like a board game though too. It is an actual game. It's a race, right? And then we never know, where we're going to go next. You never know what your next challenge or your next clue is going to be. So you have to always be ready for anything. Sometimes you have to self-drive. Other times it can be a very physical challenge. Other times it's a mental challenge, and as you go from one to another, it's mentally, physically, emotionally, and it's just very, very exhausting. The question is, how do I go about, this the right way, being cool the whole entire time too? So I wanted to relate that, let's say, back to college applications. It's also about not getting overwhelmed. I think staying positive, and pacing yourself. But most importantly, I think also communicating with your parents, with your college counselors, even with your students and your fellow classmates, or of course with your crimson strategists and everything too. I was recently talking to another friend of mine whose daughter is currently right now applying to various universities too. And one thing that I want to share with you too, Alex, is when you asked me earlier about how is it different now than when I applied to school. When I applied to school back in 1989, I think so, 1989, 1988, we would share with our friends, our classmates, where we were applying to school, where we got in, where we didn't. Now it's gotten to a point now here at SAS, like the Singapore American School, where the students will not divulge where they are applying to school at all. It's become so competitive. You and I, let's say you and I are good friends. We grew up with childhood friends. We went through the entire international school system, but I'm not going to share with you where I'm applying to school. I will only tell you where I got into school. So that just kind of gives you an idea of how competitive it is now, though, too. I think it's just crazy where you and I, it's not like we're enemies. We're actually good friends, but I think it's about like, I don't want you to know where I'm applying to school in case you apply there or in case I don't get into that school. So it's become so cutthroat competitive. I'm like, wow, this is crazy. I think these kids it's so much, I think for them, this 11th grade, or this junior year in school is, probably one of the most, I think, defining years in their life in terms of how they go about it, in terms of how well they do on their standardized tests, in terms of what they decide to do during this year, in terms of trying to propagate, trying to, I think, strengthen their own, I think, profile, their own narrative, making themselves look good. And so it's a lot of stress. When you get to a point where I don't even want to share with you, my good friend, where I'm going to apply to school, then you're like, wow, this is some serious business. This is no joke.
Thanks for listening to Top of the Class. Subscribe for future episodes. For show notes and to plan your best future, head to crimsoneducation.org.